Can you believe that a city built of pure gold and consecrated by God Himself could hide the largest, most terrifying secret in the history of the known world? This wasn't just a capital. It was the entire hope of civilization. A diamond sitting precariously on the throat of 3 warring continents. And yet, every single night, when the citizens of Constantinople finally drifted into sleep, a silent, deadly war began that threatened to erase their existence from the map of time itself. They slept soundly, tucked away behind walls that were considered utterly impregnable, the legendary Theodosian walls, triple barriers of granite, fire, and absolute faith that had deflected the mightiest armies the globe had ever produced, from the Avars to the Bulgars. But what good are those colossal, terrifying defenses when the most lethal enemy is already inside the sacred gates, tucked away in the shadows of the imperial hippodrome, whispering deadly secrets into the ears of ambitious eunuchs and poisoning the ceremonial wine of emperors? We are talking about the Byzantine Empire, not in its glorious, sunlit hours of triumph and trade, but the Byzantine Empire at night. A place of unparalleled paranoia, where the most beautiful mosaics held the darkest truths, and the slightest sound outside your bedchamber could mean a messenger delivering a priceless crown, or an assassin delivering a swift, permanent end to your bloodline. The daytime facade was impossibly dazzling. Processions of silks and porphyry, the deafening clamor of the mace, the unbelievable wealth flowing into the coffers of the Basileus from every corner of the known earth. But as the immense golden sun dipped beneath the waters of the Marmara Sea, painting the Golden Horn in hues of ominous blood and fading sapphire, the true, hidden masters of the empire emerged from the darkness. These nocturnal power brokers were not the brave generals fighting desperately on the frontiers, holding back the relentlessly encroaching Persian tide, or the unstoppable, zealous Arab tsunami that wanted to extinguish the Roman light forever. No, these were the inner circle of schemers, the professional poisoners, the terrifying priests who wielded dogma like a razor wire dipped in venom, and the empress who saw her own husband only as a temporary, fragile obstacle to be dramatically and permanently removed. A single misstep in this obsidian game of thrones, a forgotten prayer, a misplaced loyalty, or a simple cup of compromised ceremonial wine, and the entire structure of the Roman world, which Constantinople claimed to still embody and protect, would instantly collapse into dust and ashes. This wasn't merely the petty squabbling of politics. This was the exhausting, minute-by-minute struggle for historical survival. They were perpetually surrounded by a hostile universe that wanted them brutally dead. And yet, in the shadows, they were constantly, fatally, their own greatest threat. Imagine the deafening silence of the great palace after midnight, a sprawling, echoing labyrinth of expensive marble and absolute fear that stretched for miles along the seawall, its foundations holding secrets centuries old and smelling faintly of blood and betrayal. Every shadow was a highly trained spy. Every whisper carried the instantaneous weight of high treason. The great halls, empty of the day's retinue of glittering officials and foreign envoys, became the perfect stages for silent, deadly plays, where the main props were daggers hidden beneath heavy imperial robes and highly potent, slow-acting Venetian arsenic, custom-ordered for specific targets. The Basileus, the emperor himself, the supposed God-chosen ruler of all that remained of mighty Rome, often found himself utterly, terrifyingly alone, locked away in his heavily guarded chamber, praying with white knuckles that the Praetorian guards posted directly outside his solid golden door were truly loyal, and not secretly paid agents of his own conniving sister, or worse, his own ambitious, beautiful, and deeply resentful wife. While the palace relentlessly hunted itself from within, outside the impenetrable Theodosian walls, the real, external catastrophe was gathering unstoppable speed under the dark sky. Picture the massive, terrifying armies of the Khagan, the ruthless, iron-willed horsemen of the steppe, or the disciplined, calculating lines of the Sassanid Shahanshah, drawing ever closer to the golden gates under the complete cloak of midnight, their silent objective being nothing less than total annihilation. They didn't actually need to violently breach the massive walls. They just needed the Byzantines to be fully consumed by their own internal, ceaseless, nocturnal madness first, ensuring the city would fall not with a bang, but with a silent, poisoned whimper. The city of Constantinople was a perfect beacon, shining so unbelievably brightly it attracted every vicious predator on earth. But that mesmerizing light was powered by a fragile fuel source, the blood of emperors, that was perpetually running dangerously dry, threatening to snuff out the light completely. This is the story of the hidden history, the desperate, high-stakes maneuvers, and the sheer, exhausting, generational paranoia that somehow kept the Byzantine flame flickering for a miraculous 1,000 years against all odds. It is the history of the greatest city in the medieval world when the sun finally went down, and the true, chilling nightmare began to stalk the streets. Brace yourselves, because we are about to step behind the heavy velvet curtains of the most magnificent, terrifyingly secretive, and spectacularly doomed civilization the world has ever known. This is the Byzantine night, and trust me, the shadows are truly hungry for the secrets they hold. The sun has fled the hippodrome, and the last sliver of light catches the golden mosaics of the great palace, known as the Magnora. But don't be fooled by the glow. This is not safety. This is the center of the world's most luxurious prison, a gilded cage where the emperor, the Basileus, sleeps lighter than a stray dog, if he sleeps at all. Every hinge, every tapestry, every shadow cast by the immense flickering oil lamps is a potential dagger, a whispered conspiracy waiting for the midnight hour to strike. The true sentinels of the Byzantine night were not the armored legions visible in the daylight parades. They were the silent watchers, the massive, terrifyingly loyal, yet easily compromised core of chamberlains and body servants, particularly the eunuchs, who controlled every single inch of access to the porphyra, the purple chamber where the true heir was born. These men heard everything, saw nothing, and held the emperor's life in their smooth, quiet hands, knowing that a single drop of poison slipped into the night's wine meant instant, horrifying elevation for themselves, or sudden, agonizing death for their master. They were the gatekeepers of destiny, and their silent power was the fuel for 1,000 years of nightly terror. But the insidious rot extended far beyond the immediate palace walls and the emperor's dinner plate. Deep within the city, activated only when the curfew bell tolled from the great tower, was the terrifying and ubiquitous network known as the Agentis in Rebus, literally, those who handle affairs, the Byzantine Secret Service. These men were the spies, disguised as imperial couriers, constantly traveling the vast, snake-infested network of imperial roads, collecting whispers from Antioch to Ravenna, from the Danube frontier to the deserts of Egypt. Their reports, sealed with wax only the emperor could break, formed the real intelligence matrix, but they were also the primary instrument of paranoia, weaponizing rumors into death warrants for ambitious generals or troublesome senators. Imagine this: the Emperor Justinian, perhaps the most powerful man on earth, the restorer of the empire's greatness, yet utterly consumed by a paralyzing existential fear that gripped him every time he closed his eyes. He didn't just fear the Goths or the Sassanid Persians. He feared the man who poured his water, the general he had just decorated, the priest who offered his blessing. He institutionalized paranoia, creating a state machine where denouncing a neighbor, even on the flimsiest, most vindictive evidence, could instantly earn you a reward and elevate your status within the treacherous social ladder. The result? A perpetual, empire-wide state of high alert. A systemic cancer that made everyone look over their shoulder, even in the absolute security of the sacred palace, transforming Constantinople into a magnificent but deeply poisoned ecosystem. Even the public spectacle was weaponized under the cloak of darkness, proving that the night could turn pleasure into political warfare. The massive chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, were not just sports teams. They were ruthless paramilitary organizations, organized street gangs, and political pressure groups, capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of rioters in a single terrifying hour. The infamous Nika riots proved they could burn half the magnificent city to the ground and almost topple the throne itself. And those initial, deadly plots were always hatched under the dim, smoky light of tavern lanterns, fueled by fermented grape juice and whispered promises of vast gold reserves or political favors. These factions were the night's true street armies, ready to spill blood for either side of a palace coup. While internal strife simmered and threatened to boil over into civil war at any moment, the city was constantly under siege, not by siege engines or catapults, but by cunning espionage from beyond the famed walls. The Sassanid Persians, the Byzantines' eternal, brilliant, and deeply feared enemies to the east, mastered the art of infiltration better than any contemporary power. They didn't need to conquer the immense Theodosian walls. They just needed to buy a disgruntled general with a spectacular bribe, slip a poison-tipped dagger to a key administrator, or systematically poison the wells of information at the capital. Byzantine night meant watching not just your own people, but the shadowy figures slipping past the Golden Gate, claiming to be harmless silk merchants, but carrying detailed maps detailing the city's drainage system and the location of key armories. When the emperor called the silentium, the formal decree demanding absolute, immediate silence across the entire palace complex, it was never for rest or meditation. It was for cold, calculated plotting. These were the grave hours where imperial titles were stripped, heads were ordered severed, and the complex, beautiful, and utterly merciless Byzantine legal code was bent into a pretzel to justify the execution of a rival general or the blinding of a potential usurper. The necessary paperwork had to be flawless, the legal narrative bulletproof, because even successful coup plotters needed the veneer of legitimacy to maintain the facade of imperial order. The wealth of Constantinople was staggering, drawn from trade routes stretching from China to Scandinavia, making it the richest city the world had ever seen. But this staggering wealth was also the source of its most potent and pervasive nightly corruption. Imagine the immense imperial treasury, the Sacellum, piled high with millions of solid gold solidi. Every single night, administrators and tax collectors were playing a deadly, high-stakes game of fractional reserve, scheming vast sums from the imperial coffers, knowing that discovery meant instant public blinding, or having boiling oil poured down their throat in the marketplace. This deep-seated, institutionalized theft, known as the clamata, the pilfering, was the true internal rot historians often overlooked, the gradual siphoning of the empire's lifeblood under the cover of darkness. The massive Theodosian walls, the triple barrier that protected Constantinople for 1,000 years, look eternally imposing in the daylight. But at night, they become acoustic nightmares. Guards, tired, bored, and often corrupted, might miss the sound of a small, unauthorized boat scraping the massive harbor chain across the Golden Horn. Or, worse, the hushed tones of a trader meeting an enemy agent near the vulnerable Blachernae Palace, the section of the walls often guarded by the most corrupt or least competent provincial soldiers. The Byzantine night was a terrifying symphony of suspicion, a deadly dance where the greatest threat was never the external army rattling the gates, but the brilliant, ruthless mind operating just a few feet away, hiding behind a thick veil of ritualistic loyalty and blinding golden embroidery. We must now turn our attention to the one figure who truly mastered this dark game: the Empress, the often overlooked yet truly terrifying power behind the night's darkest machinations. The woman who knew exactly how to wield the eunuch network and the agentes in rebus like a finely honed, invisible knife. The stage is perfectly set for the rise of a legendary, horrifying figure. The stage had been set, but the player who stepped into the dreadful spotlight was not the emperor with his golden crown, but the Empress, a former actress, a dancer, a woman whose origins lay deep in the shadows of the city's notorious underbelly. This was Theodora, the figure whose very existence shattered the porcelain fragility of Byzantine custom, and whose gaze could freeze the blood of the highest senator. Her power was not derived from law, but from an absolute, terrifying understanding of human weakness and the intricate, lethal mechanics of fear that only functioned perfectly under the cover of night. She knew the language of the street, the silent currency of favors, and the exact weight of a threat whispered behind closed doors. Justinian, the architect of law and stone, relied on her to manage the darkness he dared not acknowledge. The first tool in their nocturnal arsenal was the terrifying network known as the agents in rebus, the men of affairs. Officially, they were the imperial couriers, maintaining the vast, ancient cursus publicus, the state-run postal system. But their true purpose was far more sinister. They were the emperor's secret police, moving across the empire like invisible specters, immune to local jurisdiction and answerable only to the Magister Officiorum. They were the eyes that never slept, gathering intelligence on tax evasion, military disloyalty, and, most crucially, any whiff of treasonous whispering among the aristocracy. Imagine the scene: a solitary rider arriving at a remote outpost just before dawn, delivering a sealed scroll containing orders, but also carrying in his memory the precise details of who met whom in the shadows of the harbor just hours before. The empire was held together not by love, but by the sheer, paralyzing omnipresence of these unseen agents. Complementing the agentes was the legendary, utterly indispensable power of the imperial eunuchs. These men were the hinges of the great palace, controlling all access to the sacred bedchamber. Their power was absolute within the walls because they had no sons, no dynastic ambitions that could threaten the emperor's line. Their loyalty was a terrifying, laser-focused instrument of state. The Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi, the chief eunuch, could make or break careers, control the flow of state secrets, and execute the most delicate and often dirtiest tasks without leaving a paper trail. When a senator mysteriously fell ill after a midnight feast, or when a general was quietly recalled from the field to face a charge of corruption, the silent hand of the eunuch network had usually been the catalyst. They were the regime's ghostwriters of history. But the greatest, most visible threat that flourished every night was the organized chaos of the factions, the blues and the greens. These were far more than simple fan clubs for the hippodrome chariot races. They were highly politicized, semi-military urban militias, controlling vast swaths of the city's population and acting as conduits for both genuine popular discontent and the manipulative ambitions of the elite. When the sun set, the hippodrome was silent, but the streets became their territory. Rivalries were settled with iron and fire, and the faction leaders often held greater sway over the daily lives of the populace than the city prefect himself. Their energy was volcanic, and Justinian and Theodora tried the most dangerous gamble of all, to use one faction to control the other, attempting to channel this raw anarchic power for imperial benefit. This delicate balance shattered in the winter of 532 AD. Justinian, ever the zealous reformer, had cracked down hard on both factions, executing some leaders to restore order. But in a twist of fate that the people immediately deemed divine providence, two of the condemned men, one blue, one green, escaped the gallows after the ropes broke during the execution. They sought sanctuary in a church, and the entire city held its breath. The populace demanded clemency. Justinian demanded blood. The festering tension boiled over during the races. The insults hurled at the emperor from the stands quickly turned into coordinated political demands. The factions, mortal enemies for decades, suddenly united, fueled by shared outrage against a heavy-handed imperial regime. Their chant began as a low rumble in the hippodrome, but it quickly became the definitive, horrifying war cry that echoed off the golden domes of Hagia Sophia. Nika, Nika, victory, victory. Within hours, the city was engulfed in flames. Not just one district, but huge swaths of Constantinople were deliberately set alight. The prefecture, the public baths, the Senate House, and even the great church itself were consumed by the inferno. The golden facade was melting. The night had finally swallowed the city whole, transforming the capital into a living nightmare of smoke, screams, and anarchy. The mob was hunting, not just for rival gang members, but for Justinian's ministers, dragging them from their homes and executing them in the streets. The imperial palace, the physical manifestation of unstoppable Roman power, was besieged. Inside the palace, panic reigned. The noise was deafening, the light of the burning city visible through every window. Justinian, the mighty emperor, was broken. He watched the flames lick closer to the imperial sanctuary and ordered his most trusted servants to prepare the escape ships. He would abandon Constantinople, saving his life and the remnants of the treasury. The senators were already packing their own bags. The generals were advising flight. The empire was teetering on the edge of utter collapse, saved only by a sudden, terrifying silence in the room. Theodora stepped forward, her face hard, illuminated by the distant, terrifying glow of the burning city. She looked at her husband and delivered the words that would ensure that the next morning, the night would be stained not just with smoke, but with the deepest, unforgivable crimson. She refused to flee, stating that purple, the imperial color, made a magnificent shroud. The escape ships would remain empty, but the Hippodrome was about to receive a terrible, final guest. The air in the Chalkgate vestibule was thick, not with the familiar scent of expensive incense, but with the metallic tang of destiny and the sweat of paralyzing fear. Empress Theodora's pronouncement that purple was the only acceptable shroud had been the ultimate, terrifying dare, a direct challenge to the screaming, victorious mob just beyond the heavy bronze doors. It was calculated, chilling theatricality, designed to shatter the paralysis that had gripped the Emperor Justinian, and shame the generals who were desperately planning their watery escape routes. The Senate was openly weeping. The chief legal officers were dissolving into puddles of dread. But one man was listening with the cold, precise calculation of a master butcher whose hands were already steady. That man was Flavius Belisarius, the genius general, the shield and the sword of the empire, whose name would soon be synonymous with both unstoppable conquest and unimaginable horror, from the sands of North Africa to the frozen plains of the Danube. His face, usually a masterpiece of stoic military discipline, showed a faint, almost imperceptible hardening, the acknowledgement that the gilded legal structure had finally failed. Belisarius understood the language of power better than any orator in the entire Roman world. When law breaks down, only raw, focused, and unquestionable violence can fully restore the divine order of the Basileus. He turned his gaze, heavy and dark, toward the emperor, who could only return the stare with a flicker of terrified relief. No words were needed. Belisarius had received the silent command that burned hotter and heavier than any verbal decree ever could, the terrifying license to commit any atrocity necessary to ensure the continuation of the Byzantine state. Under the deep shadow of the colossal bronze statue of Theodosius, an icon of past imperial might, the loyalist forces gathered in absolute silence. These were not the polished, brightly uniformed parade troops of the capital. These were the Bucelleri, Belisarius's own private cavalry guard, men whose loyalty was bought in the purest form of gold, and whose service was paid for in the cheapest coin of human blood. They were professional killers, hardened by campaigns against the Persian Sassanids, men who asked no questions about the moral geometry of their targets, only the fastest angle of approach. They moved like wraiths through the deserted side streets of Constantinople, the heavy clang of their scale armor deliberately muffled by thick layers of wool blankets draped over their horses' flanks and tightly wrapped around their weaponry. Their objective was singular, terrifying, and precise. The Hippodrome, the sprawling entertainment complex where the green and blue factions, previously mortal enemies, had merged into a singular, drunken, revolutionary beast. This beast was now crowned, having placed Hypatius, the nephew of the deposed Emperor Anastasius, upon a makeshift throne, demanding Justinian's head on a spike. The crowd, swollen to a massive, euphoric 50,000 souls, was utterly ecstatic, completely convinced they had won the night and seized the empire. They believed the gates were sealed, the palace emptied, the revolution complete and irreversible. They were chanting victory slogans, their voices echoing off the monumental spina and the Egyptian obelisk, oblivious that the game had shifted dramatically from a political siege to a military execution, a trap already sprung. The night had granted them anonymity for their rebellion, but it was about to grant Belisarius the perfect, horrific cover for a massacre that would redefine the word purge. Belisarius split his forces for optimal slaughter. General Narses, the elderly yet deceptively lethal eunuch general, took a smaller, quicker contingent to secure the gates near the imperial box, the Kathisma, ensuring that no one, especially the newly crowned pretender, could escape the central killing ground. Belisarius himself led the main, heavier charge, maneuvering his cavalry through the massive western entrance, historically known as the Gate of Death, ironically named for the gladiators who often perished there, but tonight consecrated for the common citizens of the capital. The first sign of doom that reached the celebrants wasn't a trumpet blast or a shouted command, but the sudden, terrifying silence of the handful of stadium guards who had defected hours earlier. Then came the terrifying sound of rending metal and tearing flesh as the Bucellerie burst inward, like a tidal wave of sharpened iron, their heavy spathas drawn and moving in practiced arcs of death. The crowd, accustomed only to the predictable patterns of riot police and skirmishes, was utterly unprepared for this level of systematic, methodical, military-grade slaughter. They were instantly trapped, crushed between the high, unforgiving walls of the stadium and the whirling, relentless storm of steel and hooves. The carnage lasted for hours, a brutal, focused butchery that turned the gleaming marble stands and the meticulously raked sand of the arena into a slick, steaming horror show dyed deep crimson with arterial spray. The hippodrome, designed for spectacle and speed, became the most efficient killing field in the entire empire. The loud, proud cheers of the mob transformed into a single, collective, desperate shriek of agony, a sound that was abruptly and violently cut short, again and again, by the precise, downward swing of a cavalry sword. The air hung impossibly thick with the metallic perfume of death, a scent that Justinian, watching from a hidden vantage point, would never manage to forget, not even decades later. In the final chaotic confusion, General Narses located Hypatius and Pompeius, the primary leaders of the revolt, huddled pitifully in the imperial viewing lounge, still wearing their absurd, makeshift crowns of rebellion. The irony was utterly devastating. They had claimed the purple, but the true purple, the terrible color of imperial bloodlust and retained power, was now staining the white tunic of Narses himself. They were dragged out, not executed immediately, but held as a terrifying symbol for the morning light, The message resonated throughout every silent street in the city. No one, absolutely no one, challenges the divine right of the Basileus and lives to see the dawn. When the sun finally, hesitantly, dared to touch the horizon, the great city was unnervingly silent, a silence far more profound and terrifying than the previous night's roar of the mobs. The official count, the sanitized version carefully prepared for the historical records, claimed 30,000 dead within the confines of the massive hippodrome. 30,000 Roman citizens wiped out in a single, terrifying, focused night. It was the absolute zenith of imperial paranoia and calculated ruthlessness, a surgical purge so extreme it redefined the very limits of Byzantine power and terror. Justinian and Theodora emerged from the palace, not to cheering crowds and celebratory trumpets, but to a vast city utterly and completely subjugated by monumental fear. They walked over the newly mopped marble floors, knowing, deep in their imperial hearts, that the empire had been saved only by an act of spectacular, unforgivable horror. From that horrifying night forward, the emperor, who had once dreamed only of restoring Rome's ancient glory, would forever be haunted by the echoing screams bouncing off the white marble canyons of the hippodrome. The Nika riots proved definitively that the greatest, most immediate threat to Byzantium wasn't the distant Persians or the marching barbarians. It was the poison of dissent festering deep within the golden, suffocating cage of Constantinople itself. The poison of dissent was not a slow-acting venom. It was a rapid, systemic infection that turned brother against brother, father against son, until the very foundation of the Golden Throne was nothing more than shifting sand and terror. The most fearsome enemy to the Basileus was never the distant pagan hordes marshalling on the frontier, but the silent, gilded boot of the protovestiarios, stepping softly through the corridors of the great palace after midnight. This was the era of the whispered accusation, the subtle nod in the darkened antechamber that sealed a man's fate faster than any formal decree. Every ambitious general, every jealous cousin, every single member of the sacred Senate knew that the difference between ruling the world and spending the rest of their days in a frigid monastery cell, or worse, was the distance of one swift blade stroke in the dark. The true power in Constantinople was not held by the man who wore the purple, but by the network of spies, informers, and, most terrifyingly, the vast silent army of eunuchs who governed the inner sanctum of the sacred bedroom. These men, stripped of the ability to create heirs, devoted their terrifying focus entirely to the perpetuation of the Turret dynasty, making them either the emperor's most reliable shield or the most deadly, undetectable dagger. Their loyalty was to the institution of the purple, not the flesh and blood currently occupying it. They were the ears that heard every treacherous sigh, and the eyes that witnessed every secret meeting in the hidden tunnels beneath the Augustion. They were the administrators of the night, managing the labyrinthine system of palace guards, trusted servants, and the dreaded Silentium, the secret council where fates were decided without a single written word, ensuring no incriminating evidence ever left the room but the corpse of the condemned. Imagine the scene. Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, famous for his daytime iron will, now sleepless, clutching the sacred cross, knowing that every curtain rustle could conceal a killer dispatched by his own blood relative, the Porphyrogenitos cousin he had failed to sideline. The air itself in the Chrysotriklinos, the golden reception hall, was thick with the scent of paranoia and expensive incense trying vainly to mask the stench of fear. The great mosaics of Christ Pantocrator looked down not in judgment, but in cold, silent witness to the nightly parade of betrayal. And the ultimate weapon wielded in this nocturnal civil war was not the axe or the spear, but the searing, blinding heat of the hot poker. To blind a political rival was the Byzantine statement of finality. It was a theological assassination. An imperfect man, one who could no longer perceive the light of God's perfect creation, was rendered unfit to rule God's chosen city. It was a punishment more terrifying than death, condemning the victim to wander forever in a darkness far deeper than the absence of light, a darkness of total political annihilation. When General Bardas Phocas rebelled for the second time, his fate was sealed not by execution, but by the sight of his own two sons, powerful men who had challenged the throne, being led away to the ophthalmia, the blinding chamber, their screams echoing in the marble halls, a warning to every soldier in the capital. The emperors themselves lived under this constant psychological siege. They knew that power was a liquid thing, always threatening to spill out of their hands and into the lap of the next ruthless opportunist. Many were driven to madness, sleeping only during the day while their trusted guards watched, convinced that the night brought forth not merely men, but demons seeking their sacred soul. Consider Empress Zoe, a woman of legendary ambition, navigating a series of puppet husbands. She used the darkness as her greatest tool, ensuring her rivals' accidents occurred precisely when the city was shrouded in absolute blackness, making accountability impossible. If a patrician was found drowned in the cisterns, it was always officially a tragic fall, but every citizen, from the lowest fishmonger to the highest senator, knew the empress had merely been tidying up her potential successor list. This nightly attrition required a different kind of army. The heterea, the foreign mercenary corps, often played the role of the ultimate insurance policy. Varangians, Norsemen, and Rus, massive men who spoke no Greek and cared nothing for Byzantine politics, were the perfect night watchmen. Their loyalty was mercenary, pure, and terrifyingly reliable. They guarded the emperor's physical body for gold, and only for gold. They cared nothing for the subtle, internal politics, only for the sound of their axes hitting bone if they heard an unauthorized footstep near the imperial apartments. Yet even these giants could be turned. The Whisper campaign, the promise of unimaginable wealth, could corrupt the purest guard. The night was a massive, living organism, breathing plots and conspiracies, and the greatest fear was always the dawn. Because if you survived the darkness, you might just have to face the blinding light of the executioner's final judgment. The Byzantine night was not merely a time for quiet slumber and muffled revelry. It was the sacred, terrifying operational hour for the agents of the silent purge, men whose power was inverse to their visibility. The darkness of Constantinople was the workspace of the Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi, the chilling master of the sacred bedchamber, a eunuch of terrifying influence who held the keys to the emperor's most vulnerable moments, meaning he held the keys to the empire's throat. His authority was absolute, yet ethereal, a ghostly hand guiding the steel that ended the lives of rival ministers, rebellious generals, or even inconvenient family members who dared to sleep too soundly within the labyrinthine walls of the great palace. These eunuchs were the empire's shadows, men who had traded their birthright for an unnatural, unwavering loyalty forged in silver and silk, seen as the perfect, emotionless instruments of imperial paranoia because they could never seize the throne themselves. Imagine a cold, polished marble corridor in the dead of the second watch, lit only by the flickering oil lamps that cast monstrous, dancing shadows. And suddenly, the soft, slippered approach of the Grand Chamberlain. You would know instantly that your fate was sealed not by a roar of public accusation, but by the whisper of a man who owned the night and the silence, carrying a scroll stamped with the imperial signet, or perhaps a cup of chilled, sweetly scented wine. The most deadly plots rarely involved siege engines or open revolt. They involved poison slipped into the communal chalice during a midnight liturgy, or the sudden, unexplained illness of a formidable general whose loyalty had become too formidable. This was the reign of the subtle, lethal arts, perfected over centuries of uninterrupted, deadly courtly life. Consider the chilling legend of Empress Theophano, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her calculated, cold-blooded ruthlessness, a true predator of the imperial night. She was the architect of the final lethal hours of both her first husband, Emperor Romanos II, and later the mighty soldier emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, demonstrating with horrifying precision how the pillow could be infinitely more dangerous than the sword. The night Nikephoros Phocas met his end was a masterclass in stealth terror, a textbook example of how darkness enabled the impossible. A blizzard raged outside, the perfect acoustic cover, muffling the oars of the conspirators' boats as they slipped across the Golden Horn and scaled the seawalls near the Bucaleon Palace, an act of sheer audacity that could never be attempted in daylight.
John Timiscus, Nikephoros' own nephew and rival, led the assassins through the hidden passages, guided by Theophano herself, who had ensured the personal guard was conspicuously absent, perhaps deep in drunken slumber, or perhaps simply gone, paid off by the Empress's hidden reserves of gold.
They found the old warrior emperor sleeping not in the royal bed, but on a bearskin rug on the floor, clinging to his ascetic ideals, even in the terrifying face of oblivion. The ensuing struggle was brief, brutal, and utterly silent, save for the muffled impact of steel on bone, a horrifying whisper swallowed by the storm's roar, a crime that went unheard by the sleeping city. When Tzimiskes' men dragged the mutilated body of the emperor into the light of a flickering lamp, the horror was palpable, a betrayal so profound it seemed to shock the very foundations of the empire. Yet, the true power of the night was its ability to freeze time and grant impunity. For those few critical hours, before the sun could rise and expose the bloodstains on the porphyry floor, Tzimiskes and Theophano had already secured the capital, bribed the barracks, and sealed the key gates of the palace complex. They used the darkness not just for the crime, but for the immediate political consolidation, ensuring that when the glorious sun finally rose over the gilded dome of the Hagia Sophia, the reign of a new emperor was already an unchangeable, bloody fact, established under the cloak of midnight. This constant cycle of midnight betrayal necessitated a terrifying countermeasure: the institutionalization of paranoia. Enter the agentes in rebus, the imperial secret service, a sprawling web of informers and spies who moved like specters through the crowded districts and desolate alleyways of Constantinople after sunset. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, answerable only to the Magister Officiorum, and their reach extended far beyond the capital, monitoring governors, tracking military loyalty, and rooting out nascent heresies in the eastern provinces with ruthless efficiency. Their greatest tool was anonymity, often disguised as simple merchants, pious beggars, or even priests. They listened in the smoky taverns of the Chalcopratea district, translating drunken boasts and careless complaints into damning state evidence that sealed countless fates. If an agent marked you, your shadow became a lethal predator. The process was chillingly swift. A quiet knock at the door, just as midnight bells tolled. The sudden flash of a simple badge identifying the imperial mandate. And then, only silence and an empty room by morning. No formal charges, no public trial, just the slow, terrifying realization by your family that you had been swallowed whole by the state apparatus, perhaps exiled to a desolate fortress near the Black Sea, or worse, silently executed in the deepest, forgotten dungeons beneath the great palace. This systemic fear, the knowledge that any stranger could be an agent of the emperor's paranoia, turned neighbor against neighbor, cementing the internal rot that the golden facade tried so desperately to hide. The irony was brutal. While the generals on the outer walls watched nervously for the silhouette of an Arab fleet or the warning fires of a Bulgarian camp, The true, debilitating battles were fought silently inside the walls, battles of whispers, daggers, and poison. Every emperor knew that the true enemy was not the barbarian outside, but the ambitious cousin, the jealous minister, or the too competent general who slept 3 chambers down the same corridor. And so the night continued its relentless reign over Constantinople, a glorious city built on fear, where the most beautiful mosaics concealed the deepest shadows, and where survival was never about strength, but about anticipating the inevitable, deadly turn of the political knife. The darkness always came, heavy and suffocating, and the greatest terror was the simple, undeniable fact that in the Byzantine Empire, the night was always watching, and it was always hungry. They say the walls of the great palace were lined with gold, but beneath that shimmering facade, they were lined with ears, and those ears belonged to the emperor himself, echoing the paranoia that kept the entire machinery of the empire grinding forward. The silence of the capital after the curfew bell was not peace. It was the suffocating absence of sound necessary for the perfect, unsanctioned crime, the kind of necessary evil that only absolute power could justify. Tonight, the crime was not against the state, but for the state, carried out by ghosts who wore the imperial signet ring and operated in the lethal vacuum between sunset and dawn. These were not common thugs or city guards, but men trained in the exquisite, terrifying art of making powerful people vanish without leaving a single trace of blood on the sacred porphyry floor. Operatives known only to the Sacellarius and the emperor's private chamberlain. They were the secretari, the most trusted enforcers, operating entirely outside the purview of the eparch or the official city prefect. Their names unknown even to the men they worked alongside during the day. Their mission, often scribbled in code on wax tablets delivered by eunuchs just before midnight, usually concerned the disposal of a cousin who dared to wear too much purple, a general who grew too popular with the soldiers, or a son who had the profound misfortune of being born to the wrong empress. The Byzantine court, the very pinnacle of Christian civilization, was also a purple nursery that routinely transformed itself into a purple graveyard. To be born in the purple meant unimaginable glory and limitless power, but it also meant you had a magnificent diamond-encrusted target painted squarely on your back, visible only in the flickering light of a stolen oil lamp. The most dangerous place in the known world was not the battlefield against the Avars or the relentless Sassanids. It was the meticulously guarded nurseries of the great palace itself, where the true war of succession was waged. How many potential emperors, how many legitimate heirs, simply succumbed to a sudden, feverish illness that only struck those deemed politically inconvenient by the reigning Basileus. The court physicians were not just masters of diagnosing death, they were often trained in the swift, untraceable delivery of it, turning simple medicinal herbs into exquisite terminal cocktails. The emperor's paranoia was the true contagion, spreading from the gilded throne room down to the lowliest kitchen servant, because everyone knew the night belonged to the executioner. The most common technique, favored for its chilling efficiency and the plausible deniability it offered the next morning, was the silent poison, a slow, tasteless venom mixed into the imported wine, or the elaborate, honey-drenched desserts only reserved for the elite. But sometimes the threat was too immediate, the plotting too loud, and speed was required. And that meant the terrifying, unmistakable knock on the heavy oak door at 2 a.m., the guards silent, the hallways empty. If you were incredibly lucky, they only removed your eyes, the traditional, horrifying punishment for imperial rivals, ensuring you could never again lead men in battle or look upon the sun, the ultimate political mercy. Blinding was a visible, permanent warning, a sign that the emperor wanted you neutralized and humiliated, not erased entirely. You were allowed to live out your days in sightless misery, a terrifying example to others. But if the paranoia was deep, if the perceived threat was existential, the methods became medieval masterpieces of cruelty, often ending in a sack, a weighted chain, and the cold depths of the Propontis. Remember the fate of Emperor Phocas, a man whose reign was a nightmare of blood, even before he was finally dragged into the hippodrome to face the righteous fury of Heraclius. When the new victor finally entered the city, the purge that followed was not a public spectacle. It was a silent, week-long bloodbath conducted entirely under the veil of the Byzantine night, where thousands vanished without witness. Phocas's remaining loyalists, the men who knew too much about the emperor's midnight cruelties and the secrets of the imperial dungeons, were hunted through the narrow, twisting alleyways of the Mysae, dragged screaming from their beds, their last sight the cold, indifferent stars above Constantinople. They weren't executed publicly by the executioner's axe. They were disappeared. Their names were scrubbed from the imperial registers, their homes were razed to the ground, and their memory was extinguished. The ultimate Byzantine punishment, damnatio memoriae, delivered by the silent sword of the palace watch. Yet none of this vast institutional terror could operate without the incredible, vast espionage network that permeated every layer of society, a suffocating spiderweb of information gathering that dwarfed any modern intelligence agency. At the heart of this network were the imperial eunuchs, often dismissed by foreign dignitaries as mere servants, but in reality they were the most powerful and dangerous men in the entire realm, capable of making and breaking emperors. They controlled the movement of every individual in the palace. They tasted every drop of food and wine. They managed the imperial treasury, and crucially, they listened to everything, all the time. They heard the whispered complaints during baths, the drunken boasts in the barracks, the traitorous poetry recited in the high towers, and they reported every single syllable back to the emperor before the sun rose. They were untouchable, lacking the ambition for the throne,
since they could not technically rule. They were the perfect, loyal conduits for the emperor's darkest whims, moving like shadows through the dimly lit halls of power, reporting every sigh, every cough, every dangerous thought. The Byzantine Empire did not fall because of one failed battle or one barbarian raid. It fell because its own heart was slowly eaten away by suspicion, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that your own breath could be reported to the emperor by the man holding your towel. This internal warfare, fought silently in the dark chambers of the Augustius, was far more corrosive than any external siege. It guaranteed that loyalty was always temporary, and ambition was always fatal. And as the sun finally dared to creep above the Golden Horn, washing the city in deceptive gold, the residents of Constantinople woke up, checked that their neighbor was still breathing, and then began the exhausting, terrifying dance of pretending they had slept soundly through the night of the assassin. The knife was put away, the poison vial emptied, and the emperor smiled from the throne, knowing that the greatest weapon he possessed was not the Theodosian walls, but the paralyzing, total terror of the previous 12 hours, a terror that demanded absolute obedience. The silence that fell upon the great palace was not the peace of a stable realm, but the deadly vacuum left by a sudden, violent displacement of power. Every courtier, every general, every whispered voice in the Augustion now understood that the game had changed. Loyalty was no longer a currency, but a temporary reprieve from oblivion, and only the emperor could grant or revoke that fragile shield. The terror of the previous night had achieved what decades of legal reforms could not: total, instantaneous discipline. But terror, like a seismic wave, always creates a countercurrent, a shadow system that thrives in the cracks of the foundation, far from the blinding light of the imperial sun. This system belonged entirely to those who stood closest yet remained unseen, the men without men, the silent architects of the Byzantine machine, the eunuchs of the sacred palace, the eunuchoi who held the keys to the empire's very pulse, and whose terrifying proximity to the ultimate power made them untouchable. The trauma had solidified the emperor's grip, yes, but it had simultaneously elevated his personal servants into demigods of administration, granting them carte blanche to operate entirely within the moral grayness that the imperial authority required, but could never officially sanction. The ultimate arbiter of this hidden influence was the parakoimomenos, the man who literally slept beside the emperor's chamber door, the chief chamberlain whose very existence was a paradox of trust and absolute exclusion from succession. He was the gatekeeper, the poison tester, the whisperer of crucial morning reports, and at night he became the ultimate intelligence broker, the invisible hand that guided the fate of provinces through selective access,
and perfectly timed memos that arrived only in the dead of the third watch. Under the cloak of night, the real business of Constantinople was conducted not in the gilded halls of the Magnaura Senate, but in the small, unassuming offices near the Porphyry Chamber, where gold and blood changed hands with shocking regularity, all overseen by these castrated masters of the dark art of bureaucracy. They were the living proof that in Byzantium, true power lay not in inherited titles or military might, but in absolute, daily access to the singular source of legitimacy, a proximity protected by ritual, fear, and the unwritten law of the palace. One such figure, the legendarily powerful Basil Lecapenus, an illegitimate son of a previous emperor, yet barred from the throne by his condition, would prove just how terrifyingly effective this non-inheritable power structure could be. He ruled, in reality, through multiple reigns, a silent, immortal fixture in the ever-shifting nightmare of court politics. When the emperor slept, Basil Lecapenus woke, managing the empire's deepest, darkest secrets with cold, relentless efficiency, ensuring that the necessary bribes were paid, the necessary enemies were neutralized, and the necessary silence was maintained at any cost to the treasury or the morale of the distant armies. But the terror was not just personal. It was institutionalized, codified, and woven into the very fabric of the Byzantine administrative state, a network so vast and complex it required its own specialized, financially motivated predators. Enter the Logothetes, not mere clerks, but the apex predators of the financial and logistical world. Men whose signature determined whether a general received supplies or a city was starved into submission, simply because they failed to offer the necessary gift to the right office. The most feared among them was the Logothetis tou Dromou, the minister of the course, the man ostensibly in charge of the imperial post road. In reality, he controlled the entire state surveillance network, managing the flow of diplomats, spies, and, most critically, information and disinformation across the entire known world. When the sun set, the Dromos offices became humming hives of espionage and logistical horror. Messengers traveled at breakneck speed across the vast, darkened highways of the empire, carrying sealed secret orders that could unleash war, depose a patriarch, or trigger the sudden, silent arrest of a wealthy provincial governor, all executed under the veil of bureaucratic efficiency. This was the operational darkness of Byzantium. The Logothete didn't need to wield a sword. His weapon was the ledger book, the travel permit, and the perfectly placed anonymous accusation that sealed a man's fate before he even knew he was being watched, making him the silent executioner of the night. The cost of maintaining this paralyzing level of systemic terror was astronomical, draining the imperial treasury through endless layers of necessary bribes, kickbacks, and necessary payoffs to ensure the eunuchs and logothetes remained loyal to the emperor, rather than the gold they handled. Historians often point to external pressures, the Arabs, the Normans, the Turks, as the cause of the empire's eventual decline. But the true, fatal wound was self-inflicted, festering in the administrative core, hidden entirely from view during the daytime fanfare. This internal rot meant that for every solidus sent to provision the valiant troops guarding the eastern frontier, perhaps 2 were diverted into the private coffers of some high-ranking administrator in the capital, guaranteeing a lifetime of luxury and protection from investigation. The Byzantine night was not just a time for plotting coups. It was the time when the empire ate itself alive, sacrificing strategic longevity for short-term political control, feeding the monster of bureaucracy just to keep its teeth pointed outward in a constant, unsustainable cycle of financial hemorrhage. Every quiet night in the palace, every successful bureaucratic maneuver by a logophete meant one more crack in the Theodosian walls, one less reserve of grain for the army, one more whispered rumor that destabilized a province. The golden veneer was slowly being peeled away by the very hands tasked with polishing it, ushering in the next, even darker phase of imperial paranoia.